Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Konarski, and I'm here at Wonders of Wildlife National Museum and Aquarium. Thank you for joining us today as we move into our second week of the month of July, continuing our theme all about forests. Along with the live stream we do each week, we also offer a really cool free virtual scavenger hunt, and that you can play right at home along with an activity guide that is included, both with new missions and activities each month. To download the app and explore all of this, just go to www.wondersofwildlife.org/mission-conservation. This address will take you to our mission conservation webpage. On this page, check the box to the right that says get the app. Click and download the button there to follow the instructions. Once you have that app downloaded, just create a user account with a login. Next, hit the search bar and type in mission conservation. This is where all of our at-home missions will pop up for you to play. If you look a little bit further down on the page, you will see our featured missions. Featured missions are the most current missions we have to offer. And the last place I want to bring your attention to on this page is the schedule of missions and activities. This section will show you all of the missions that are live, including our current mission, Forests. If you click the plus sign, it will drop down the tab and you can find the link to the activity guide for this month. The activity guide has a craft and a fun outdoor activity and something that you can do to help our forests. I'm currently standing in front of our wildlife galleries in front of the Grand Teton National Park exhibit. So if you look behind me here, in the fall, the quaking aspens, they will turn from a bright green to a yellow and orange all at the same time due to an amazing complex of interwoven root systems, making them virtually one giant living organism. Here to talk to us today are three speakers, all from the U.S. Forest Service. David, who is here in Missouri, and then Chanel and Deborah Ann up in Michigan. We're going to start off with some dendrochronology and finish up with some fire do's and don'ts. David, Chanel, how are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Awesome. You want to go ahead and let us know what dendrochronology is? That's kind of a big word there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks, Alex. Hey, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit today. My name is David Massengale, and I am a forester with the U.S. Forest Service on the Mark Twain National Forest here in southern Missouri. And my primary job here is called silviculturist. And silviculture is kind of a big word, kind of like dendrochronology, a little unusual, but basically the simplest term of silviculture is the art and science of growing trees. And so using what we can learn about trees and what we can learn from trees, that's where dendrochronology comes in. And it's a really neat kind of thing, especially some of the stuff that we're doing down here in Missouri with our shortleaf pine in some of the old stumps that we're finding and things like that, like the old stump that I've got standing behind me on my desk, which weighs a ton, by the way. So anyway, talking about dendrochronology a little bit, dendro meaning trees, chronology meaning time or timeline, that sort of thing. We're sort of looking at, how a tree can tell us about the past, just by looking at the tree itself. And one of the ways we do that, and I'm sure that everybody has done this at some point in time, is they've looked at a stump and counted the rings and sort of estimated that tree's about 80 years old. Oh, that tree's about 10 years old. Everybody has kind of looked at that. But what I wanted to start with a little bit here at the beginning is, what is a ring? What exactly is the ring? So this is how the tree produces rings. In the spring, when the trees start to break dormancy and come out, and I'm speaking kind of mainly about hardwoods, but softwoods will do this too to some degree, when they break dormancy and start up, and that's why we have rings in pretty much all trees. But when they start, they get what's called spring wood. They start putting on wood on the outside of the tree. And what that does is in the spring, typically, when it's a little wetter, the tree starts making pores that are much larger. And those bundles of pores and all along the outside edge of the tree will transition over into what we call summer wood, from spring wood to summer wood. As we get into summer, and once again, typically it gets drier. And so those rings actually start getting tighter and the pores get smaller and smaller. And so you end up with sort of large pores and small pores. And so you kind of get two different rings. Oftentimes the big pores will be lighter color, tighter pores will be a darker color. And so you kind of have two rings in essence. But what that really means is it's the same year. So when you're counting rings, you're really only counting all the light colored ones or all the dark colored ones. And so that's kind of how the tree develops its rings and how we're able to count and all this kind of thing. So one of the things that we talk about is that what can the tree rings tell us? Now, this is what we call a cookie. You can't eat it. I guess you could if you were a termite, but most of the time you don't. The tree cookie, which is cut flat like this, gives us an opportunity to look inside a stump and see rings. So you can see up in this area here, we have really narrow rings and we have really wide rings. The narrow rings indicate a time when there was less rainfall or less, the growing conditions weren't as good. So they're tighter rings, they're smaller and closer together. The wider rings show that there was a time period when things were better. There may have been more rain, a little more sunshine for growing and this sort of thing. What a dendrochronologist can do is look at those things, and they've got a timeline made up. And with that timeline, they can look at it and say, okay, we know from other trees and other data that the year, just for example, 1860 to 1865 was really dry. And so they can go back and look at their scale that they have set up from data from hundreds and thousands of trees and start matching it to a tree like this cookie here. And they may find out that, oh, look, this section right here matches the 1860 section. And so from there, they can lay their timeline down and go all the way to the pith, or what we call the heart of the tree, the center of the tree, and figure out what the time frame is. And oftentimes that'll lead them down to the center, which and where they can make an accurate or fairly accurate guess of, oh, that tree was first started growing in about 1500 or something like that. So that's what's neat about being able to do this with a cookie and this sort of thing, which is fine if you're working with stumps that are trees that are already dead. And in Missouri, that's been one of the big things we've had, is that we've got a lot of these shortleaf pine stumps in the woods. And what they're showing is, like this one here is showing current fire damage. But all of these different little ridges on it is where an older fire had burned around it and created damage. And so the tree keeps trying to repair itself every time. And so by cutting the cookie off of that, like this, we can look back and find out where there are fire scars and find out when fire was and all that kind of thing. So what the other way to do this is, when we're dealing with the stumps, it's not such a big deal to cut them. But when you're dealing with a live tree that you really don't want to cut down, but you still want to kind of know how old it is, we use things like these. This is called an increment borer. And what it is, it's a tool that we use, and you can see it has a little bit of a screw on the end of it, and it's hollow. And so we can put that up against a tree and actually screw it into the tree, and you try to hit the center of the tree. That's the idea. You try to aim for the center. You never be sure you're going to get it, but you'll get fairly close. You get it in there till you think that you've hit the center. You take this piece of it, you stick it in the back of it, and when you put it in there and pull it out, it will have, hopefully, one of these cores on it. And the core is what is just a round piece of wood, but you can see you can see the tree rings on it. You can see the growth rings up and down the tree. So you can actually take a live tree and not harm it particularly just by putting a small hole in it, and then get a core sample out like this, and you can start actually counting the rings. And what that'll do is allow you to gauge or age trees that you don't have to destroy by cutting down, and find out how old they are, whether it's growing on a really good site, whether it's not on a good site or something like that. So we've used a lot of that, and that's that part of the silviculture thing is that we've used the information that we get from trees to figure out how we want to do this. Now, one of the big things that we've tried to do is in some of the areas that we're working in, especially where we used to have a lot of shortleaf pine, and we don't have a lot of shortleaf pine anymore across the area because most of it was cut during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so we're trying to restore a lot of this and get it back to more of a shortleaf pine oak mix, but with a lot more shortleaf pine on the ground. And in a lot of the cases, these pine they're scattered a little bit more further apart, and in between them we have grasses and forbs growing. And so that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to restore in part of this restoration thing. Well, one of the things that we noticed is when we're looking at the cookies of different trees that or especially on the stumps, when we're able to cut these down, is we can go back in time and say, that's interesting because there was a fire we know about in 1701 And we also know that there was a fire in 1705 and a fire in 1715. So it gives us an idea of what the fire return interval in some of these places was. And that's all part of our restoration stuff too that we've been working on. And one of the things that we're able to do from that is create sort of a scientific study of, in Missouri, typically, they've said that their fire return interval, in other words, whenever fire came on the ground, whether it was natural caused by lightning, or whether it was man caused by either by Native Americans or Europeans, is that the fire, the ground right there burned approximately every 3 to 9 years. That's kind of a general scope of what we've learned from taking these tree samples and using cookies and things like that and finding out where these burn scars are, and able to actually put it together to kind of create basically a timeline of the way the fires were around the area. And we can go back now with prescribed fire and start trying to reintroduce fire to the ground and try to mimic what we saw before. And so I'm going to pass this on to Chanel and let her kind of go into kind of how do we use, why do we use this? What's the information from these from fire intervals and that sort of thing? How are we able to use it into the future and in the research that we do? So I will hand it to you, Chanel.
Well, thanks so much, David. So like he said, my name is Chanel Saunders. I work here up on the Ottawa National Forest, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. A lot of people don't know where that is, but maybe you can look it up later. So like he said, we are going to discuss why is this important? What can we learn from it? David was really had a fantastic story about what they do in Missouri. And it really encompasses what we do nationwide. So I want to kind of start with why we use an increment borer over just cutting a tree down. So we do have a little bit of an oops story. Back in 1957, we actually discovered in the bristlecone pine forest in California. Bristlecones are actually quite short species. They live at really high elevations. They have a bigger diameter because they're stout, they're slope growing, but they're not what we would consider a really old tree. Well, unfortunately, one was cut down and we discovered that it was approximately 5,000 years old, which was at the time the oldest tree we had ever discovered on Earth. So since then, we have started using the increment borer, and I'm going to pass it back to David real quick to show that.
Just like we were talking about before, this, being able to not really harm the tree, but only put a small hole in the tree and be able to pull out a core, which we can then count and estimate the tree's age.
Cool, thanks, David. So since then, we've utilized the increment borer, and we've actually utilized it really well. So all across the country and even the world, dendrochronology is actually about 500 years old, and it's really important to us. A lot of different facets use it, whether you're in cultural resources, you're an archaeologist, you're a fire ecologist, you're a silviculturist, or even a wildlife biologist or a climatologist. It tells us a lot about our history. So like you were saying, you can go back in time, you can see fire history and patterns, you can see drought, you can see possibly floods. Where did we have a wetland at one time? What kind of things were happening in that area? Did we have a forest that was thinned out so they put on a lot of growth? Did we have a really dense forest? It tells us a lot about whether what species were there, what happened at that time, and then it kind of tells us about what our future might look like. How are we going to manage that land? One of the things that I find really interesting is, it was a question that was posed to me when I was in college. Can you figure out how old an area is, or maybe even a certain timeline, by looking at something that's not a tree? And they were telling us that you can go back and look at timbers and old buildings and maybe see what was happening in that time frame and compare it as you count along on the tree rings to maybe trees that are still standing. So it really shows us a lot about that time frame. So why is this important to us? Well, it really helps us figure out how we're going to manage this land. What does the future look like for us? What do we need? Maybe we need to consider, plants and trees are transitioning. What species do we need on the landscape? How are we going to sustain our practices and keep timber and healthy forests? It's incredibly important to us. And I actually want to look at, since we were talking about fire history, what does natural fire look like on the landscape? Sometimes it can probably be stand replacing, or most of the time we actually need just a really low intensity fire. So I have this picture here. You can look at this. This is what a low intensity fire looks like. We have some fuel that you can see it's burning up on the landscape. It's not large fuels. It doesn't look very scary, but this is kind of what David was alluding to when you're looking at the fire history on that tree stump. So David, could you just show that again?
Here we're talking about, this is that one cookie that we had, and you can sort of see some of this is showing some old fire damage, some rot around some old fire damage, where these low intensity fires, which burned, like I was saying, here in Missouri every 3 to 9 years, something like that. The time frame may have been different up in Michigan. I mean, I'm sure it was.
Yeah, so thank you so much, David. We kind of been looking at that all across the nation. So Missouri, all the way out to California, maybe, and the giant sequoias that require fire on the landscape. They have a very specific growing area, or even jack pines maybe in Michigan and all the way into Minnesota. They require low intensity fire on the landscape. And that's important to us. It's important for the forest. It's also important for wildlife in that area. So we're thinking about a lot of things. Dendrochronology tells us a lot. And with that, I'm going to kick it off to Deborah Ann up on the Huron-Manistee, where she is going to talk to you about a really fun subject. So go ahead.
I'm Deborah Ann Brabazon, wildfire prevention, mitigation, information, and education specialist for the Huron-Manistee National Forest. And when I go camping, there's some things that I check on before I go. One is know before you go, plan and prepare. Megan, can you share some sites with my friends? First, I go to the Great Lakes Fire and Fuels, and I look to see what the current fire danger is in Michigan before I go camping in Michigan. If you click on one of the fire danger symbols, you will actually be able to see the current observations, including amount of rainfall, when the last time the rainfall was, and what the temperatures are, and predicted fire danger for the next couple days. I also like to go to the National Weather Service because they have a special product just for the National Forest in Michigan, where they list all the fire weather for the next days. And that fire weather plan is very instrumental for land managers to plan their fire activities and their resources that they may need for upcoming fire. Now, when I go camping, one of the things that I want to know is, am I going dispersed camping? Am I backpacking through? Or am I going to a developed site, much like I'm in today? When I go to a developed site, I always check to see if they have a fire ring. If they have a fire ring, I check it to make sure there's no litter in it, because we don't want to burn anything that might give off hazardous or toxic fumes. Another thing we're going to do is, when we're creating our fire, we're going to make sure that we're picking the right size fire for the right job. Most of the times when we're camping, we're looking for a cooking fire or a warming fire. And we don't want it too tall. We want to keep it small. Megan, can you share some of that fire science information I sent you? Did you know that fire is a chemical reaction? It's a combination of fuel, oxygen, and heat. And when those three are together, they actually combust and help to support the combustion of fire and spread fire. We also have 3 types of fuels that we use. 3 types of fuels that we use when we go camping to start a campfire. We'll use kindling, we'll use tinder, which are small pieces, and birch bark will always burn in the rain. So it's always one of those go-to things I look for or carry with me when I go camping. Then we also have kindling. It's bigger than my little finger, smaller than my thumb, and kind of hangs loose in the fire. And that's going to help to carry the flame up to my fuel wood, which will help sustain the fire for the rest of the duration of the campfire. Now, fire works as heat transfer. Megan, can you share with them the heat transfer that we have? Now, the best way to think about when we're camping how heat transfer works is think of it like a marshmallow. Conductive heat is that area of gases and heat that rises off the top. That is, or no, I'm sorry. Conductive heat is when you strike your match and touch the wood, or you touch your marshmallow to the burning fire. Then there's convective. That's the golden brown marshmallow area. All the gases and heat are rising and superheating all the fuels above the fire. And then there's the radiant heat. That's the heat that's given off by the fire. We move our lawn chair in, we move our lawn chair out. When the fire gets bigger and hotter, we tend to back off because the radiant heat is much warmer than the radiant heat when the fire is lower. Now, one of the things that we need to think about is the safety around our campfire. Campfires are actually tools, not toys. And more wildfires are caused by the negligence of people not taking care of their fire. And also, for children between the ages of 2 and 13, campfires are the biggest burn risk when camping the morning after, when the campfires have not been put out. Children tend to play in them, they tend to throw things in them, or sometimes they're just horse playing around the campground and actually trip and fall into the fire pit. So it's really important we think about some of the things that we're doing around our campfire. First of all, never have loose clothing. We're going to make sure that our shirts are tucked in and that our sleeves are buttoned. We make sure that we pull our hair back and put it up so that we don't have it hanging down if we're leaning in. And that's another thing. We never want to put our face close to the fire and blow in the fire. What we want to do is take something and we want to fan the fire. That'll help to put oxygen onto the fire so that our fire grows. Because fire is one of those things, oxygen is one of the things that the fire needs in order to breathe and grow and sustain itself. Now, we never run, we never push, we never really drag our feet around our campground either, because we could very easily trip on roots. But when we do get burns, we need to think about the kind of burns you can get from a campfire. The first one is a 1st-degree burn. That's like a sunburn. We might get that from being too close, or maybe we're roasting our marshmallow and our hand gets warm. But those tend to clear up after a day or two, and they're not very harmful. 2nd-degree burns are when we get much closer and the skin begins to blister. Most of those burns aren't going to show up for 12 to 24 hours, and they're going to hurt. Then there's 3rd-degree burns. Those are the burns that we don't want to have, definitely, because what tends to happen is the heat or even steam from a campfire can burn the skin, and within 24 hours, depending on how deep the burn is, it can actually slough the skin off, and you'll be able to see where the muscle is actually damaged from the fire as well. So one of the things I definitely want to remind you is never leave your campfire unattended or underattended. Never leave a child responsible for a campfire, because they can be legally, parents can be legally held responsible if something happens under the care of that child. When you have your campfire going and burning, and all of a sudden you decide, I think I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to the beach, or I'm going to go for a hike, or I'm even going to go to bed or go home from my camping trip. We need to make sure that our campfire is dead out and cold to the touch. We want to cool our coals. We want to drown, stir, and feel. And we want to make sure that our fire is dead out and cold to the touch. Now, my fire has burned down pretty much to ash. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back my pieces of wood and let out some of the extra heat that may be stored in here. Then I'm going to take my bucket very gently I'm also going to stir. And the idea is to make sure that every coal cool and the temperature has gone down. And use the back of my hand. There should be no hissing, there should be no popping, and no cracking. And even though it's starting to rain here,
Hey, Deborah Ann, just to let you know, we're having a little trouble hearing you guys on that side. It might be due to the rain there. You want to try and flip off your microphone and turn it back on real quick, see if that fixes it real fast. Looks like the rain's picked up a little bit on Deborah Ann's side, so we're gonna let them cool off for a minute, and we're gonna hop over to Chanel real quick and ask. I had some really interesting theories going on here when you were talking about studying the history of trees and what they could really teach us. And so I was just wondering, is there any like really cool discoveries that you've made while you were out studying trees, and like which ones probably stuck with you the most?
You know, Alex, that's a really fantastic question. And what comes to mind the most, when I was a teenager, I remember being in the forest with my parents, and we were kind of in the Hinckley area of Minnesota. We looked at a stump that had some really interesting marks on it, and we were kind of looking around at these giant stumps in that area, and I think they were white pine stumps, but they actually had burn scars we get from the 1894 Hinckley fire, which actually burned just over 200,000 acres at that time. It was huge for the state of Minnesota, and that was just this like amazing aha discovery. I can't believe I found this piece of history in our property area. So that's my most memorable one.
That sounds like a pretty cool, find, to see something like that. That must have been just crazy to discover. Deborah Ann, we're going to jump back to you real quick, see if you can hear us a little bit better, and maybe we can pick up again where we were. I know you were kind of at the end there, but are you guys able to come back to us? Looks like we're still having some rain on that side. So what we're going to do, David, I also had a question for you. So I'm going to ask you this real quick. Now, you were talking about dating trees. You're showing those really cool instruments and those tree cookies that you had out with all the rings on that. We were talking about some of the older trees, but what is the oldest tree that you personally have been able to date?
That's interesting. Some of the projects we work on down here, we do a lot of the dendrochronology stuff on there to see when things happened, when fires, intervals were. We had a project called the Medley Hollow Project. And during that project, we had dendrochronologists from the University of Missouri's tree ring lab come down, and they started cutting stumps, kind of like the one behind me here, and we were looking for them across the landscape, and we found several of them. They cut a couple, and they reported back to us. And what was really neat was one of the stumps that they found that they were able to cut a cookie out of, and you can't really see this real well, but it's basically just what you would expect. But the outer edge of it still read 1759, but the farthest end they could see, and of course that's not the center, but the farthest end they could see was 1594, which is, when you start thinking about that, you're like, wow, that's pretty old for a tree, especially around here. We don't, things rot pretty quickly when it's humid and things like that, but these stumps, They're kind of, they've hardened because they got a lot of resin in them and that sort of thing. But that's pretty amazing when you see things like that. I know the oldest tree right now, at least in Missouri, is an eastern red cedar, and it's dated at about 1,500 years old, and it's down on a rocky ledge on the Current River down here. So it's kind of interesting, it's just how old some of the things are and how long it sticks around. I think that's what really gets me is the other thing. I'll mention this real quick is, you know, our folks here up in Michigan, in Round Spring, which is a very large spring on the Current River, scientists found a piece of wood, pulled a log out of Round Spring from years ago. It was jack pine. It talks about when the glaciers pushed all of the northern species south, it left a jack pine log in Round Spring and it preserved it in the cold water there. So trees can show us some really neat things.
That's really, really cool. I mean, that find about, you said 1594, was it?
Yeah.
That is crazy. I was trying to do the math in my head and I was like, man, that's like 400 and almost 30 years, kind of, you know, 426, somewhere around in there. Well, that's not so good when we get to that part. The simple addition stuff kind of leaves you after a while, but that is crazy. Deborah, it looks like you guys have taken a little bit of cover there. If we're going to hop back over to you real quick. I know you were talking about campfires and all that stuff, and everything with that was just so amazing. It really got me kind of in the feeling to want to go sit around a campfire now. So I wanted to ask you, what is your favorite campfire activity or, you know, snack that you like to take with you or maybe cook there?
Well, my favorite thing to do is to make foil dinners, much like the one I made, but you can see it has a certain amount of puddling effect today from all the rain. And my favorite dessert with my foil dinners is going to be graham crackers with marshmallows and then gourmet chocolate, whether it's a Reese's peanut butter cup or a Godiva piece of chocolate or a Ghirardelli with caramel in it. I always like to do something more than just a piece of Hershey's.
Oh my gosh, you got me hungry over here now. My sweet tooth is calling me. I might have to go find something after this. But Deborah Ann, Chanel, David, I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to talk to us today. There was a lot of great information on dendrochronology and fire safety, and I think we're all ready to go and get out there and enjoy the wild areas that we have around us. And as we end our live stream, I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Make sure you also tune in next Tuesday, July 20th at 1 p.m. Central Time, as we will be continuing our forest theme and talking with Rachel Holmes, who is the urban forest lead for the Nature Conservancy. We hope to see you then, and I want to leave you guys with the understanding that we all live downstream. All right, take it, care, guys.